Welcome to Stories from the Center of the Universe, the podcast about the human experience.
Colonel Jeremy Bowling, welcome back to the Center of the Universe.
Thanks, Paul. It is good to be back in the center of the universe.
How was your first experience on this podcast?
It was great. I had not done a podcast previously, although, as you might have gathered from speaking to me, I do a lot of talking, and I have no problem talking. It's something I probably should try to do maybe a little less of, but nonetheless, hadn't done that on a podcast before. It was a great experience. I thought you did a great job. It's a great show. I was surprised. I had quite a few people who reached out, and they had a chance to listen to it, and nothing but positive feedback. So I thought it was an honor that you asked me to come back and do it again.
No, I was, as soon as I heard you talk for about 2 minutes, I'm like, I'm getting this guy back. And I already knew a little bit of your background. And of course, since that recording, because it was kind of last minute, you and Chuck joining,
right.
I've learned a lot more about you based on some reading I've done, but I'd rather hear directly from you in this format. So I appreciate your willingness to do this. I guess we should mention that you and I connected through John Hollis. How well do you know John? Just from the trip, effectively?
I got to know him quite well over this past year. I didn't know him going into 2024, but we worked very closely throughout the entire year of 24. And then another development since we last spoke, he and I, along with Chuck, have now officially stood up the nonprofit, the 501c3. So now we all three sit on the board of the Longest Climb Foundation. And so I will only get to know John better, but I would say we communicate almost daily and have gotten to know him quite well. And he's a great man.
He's a really good dude. You want to explain where the name came from?
Yeah. So the Longest Climb Foundation is a reference to the veterans of Hamburger Hill. And the reason that's a reference is because if you're at all familiar with the battle, you'll know that it occurred in the Ashaw Valley in May of '69. And the battalion that fought the battle, of course, there were others that were in support, but the main effort was 3rd of the 187, today known as the Iron Rakkasans, but at the time just the Rakkasans. And the battalion took about 70% casualties as they fought the 11-day battle. And as I'm sure you recall, a unit becomes combat ineffective much sooner than when they hit the 70% casualty mark. So by all accounts, they should have been pulled from the fight. But the battalion commander at the time, Weldon Honeycutt, call sign Blackjack, he knew that the only way that the battalion was even going to survive this thing was to keep fighting aggressively. And he was right. But as a result, 70% casualties, which means most of those guys never made it to the top of Hamburger Hill in 1969. And they didn't get a chance to get to the top of the hill until 2019, when I was the commander of 3rd of the 187, and I took them back. And so many things transpired over the course of those 2 years as we were preparing for that, but also while we were physically there. And then frankly, what has occurred once we came home from that event in 2019, many, many more veterans have come forth asking for similar help. And we do, frankly, just about anything they ask for, we try to help them. And that's the name is the Longest Climb, is because it refers to the fact that it took 50 years for those Vietnam veterans to get to the top of Hamburger Hill. And we absolutely intend to continue to give back to the rest of the Vietnam veterans who are out there that are in need of something similar. So the 501c3 exists. We are actually able to accept donations now. Frankly, we've been doing all of this out of our own pocket. We did have one very generous donor this past year when we went back with John and Sergeant Rodney Davis's family. But yeah, it's happening, and we're honored to do it. We had our strategy meeting last week, and we've laid out what 2025 is going to look like, and it's going to be another great year for the foundation.
Jeremy, describe what it's like getting up to the top of that hill with those veterans. I can't imagine that experience.
I cannot describe what it's like to get to the top of the hill or at the top of the hill without also describing what it's like climbing to the top of the hill. And the reason I say that is even though I had poured my heart and soul, and my staff had poured their heart and soul into coordinating this effort, we had no idea whatsoever things that would transpire and how powerful the experience would be, not just for the veterans, but for all of us involved. So I got to kind of tell that little story, and it is a little long. So by all means, interject, ask questions, but it'll lead to what it was like standing on top of the hill. So just a tiny history of how we even got started. I had served in the Rakkasans as a company commander, 2005, 6, and 7, and had an opportunity to observe how involved the veterans are from the Rakkasan Association. I mean, frankly, I had not served in other units that had a veterans group as dedicated and passionate as that. Maybe they're out there. I've not seen it. I'm not denigrating any other group. I'm just saying the Rakkasan veterans are very, very unique. So because I had that experience as a captain, I knew when I came out on the battalion command list, 10 plus years later, that's what I could anticipate. I had the good fortune of jumping into the 70th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy in 2014. And I got to witness firsthand the healing power of that event for those veterans of, D-Day, frankly. I mean, it was things, and I was there for a week. I was the acting G3 of the 82nd Airborne Division. So I was right there in the front of everything. And I would see little groups of veterans like sitting on the front steps of a church eating fried chicken. But these are guys that are in their 80s. And when they were together, they had the energy as if they were in their 20s. It was an incredibly powerful thing to see. So I had those experiences coming into my time as a battalion commander back in the Rakkasans. And I said, well, the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Hamburger Hill occurs while I'm in command. And I'm going to give the Vietnam veterans what I just saw those World War II veterans receive. They call them the greatest generation. And I have no doubt that they were at that time. But that wasn't the last great generation. And frankly, ours won't be. But I think the Vietnam veterans were also the greatest generation of their time. They had an entirely unique set of challenges and circumstances that they went through. And I said, well, if I can make a difference, I'm going to make a difference. And that's the impetus behind it. And I think I kind of jokingly mentioned to you last time I was on your podcast that when I came into command and I first week or so of command kind of thing, and I've got my staff and sergeant major, and I'm kind of telling them what I'm going to do and my approach. And I brought up something like that. I have no idea how I said it, of course, but I distinctly remember them telling me, sir, you're crazy. Like we're not going to be able to do that. And I was like, nope, watch me. We're going to do that. And to their credit, I mean, absolutely to their credit, they just embraced it, all got on board. And then of course I briefed my brigade commander, and he was like, I don't know about that. Maybe you need to ask the division commander. And I got to the division commander, and he just flat out said, no, you're not doing that. He goes, I want you to focus on war fighting. So I don't like to be told no. As a matter of fact, when I hear the word no, to me, it just sounds more like someone's issuing me a challenge. So I came back to the battalion. I said, all right, well, we're going to do this anyway. I said, the division commander said, no, that just means the Army can't pay for it, but we'll figure out another way. And we did, and we set about it. And so it took us about 2 years to put it all together. I mean, we were busy in between. At one point we thought we were going to go fight a war in North Korea. We did our normal, exercises and evaluations and all that stuff through a 2-year training period for an infantry battalion. But because of Chuck Casey, who you met on the last podcast, and he was a superstar in the U.S. Embassy there in Vietnam, we were able to do all the coordination with the Vietnamese government to essentially roll out the red carpet for my veterans when the time came. And so in the 2-year period leading up to that, event, every year the Hamburger Hill veterans, they come back to Fort Campbell in May, and we just call it Hamburger Hill Week. And it's an event where the veterans that can, they show up, and they just socialize with each other. They'll spend some time with soldiers and whatnot. Well, and I took command, and I called the head of the Rakkasan Association, Bob Harkins, who had been a company commander on Hamburger Hill. I said, Bob, we'd met before. I said, great to see you again. We're going to do this differently. And he's like, what are you talking about? I said, well, I've got two priorities in command. I said, priority one, war fighting. Priority two is veterans. And he was like, well, no one's ever said that before. I said, I agree. And we're going to do it differently. So I spent the first probably 9 months of command, like really building up what the 49th anniversary, because I wanted all the veterans to be there to hear this. And so because of my Ironman triathlon background and the history of that battalion, there was a competition. It was actually started by General Petraeus when he was Lieutenant Colonel Petraeus in the early 90s. He called it the Iron Warrior Competition. And it was, at the time, it was, push-ups and pull-ups and dips and stuff like that. But I said, well, I love General Petraeus. He and I are actually pretty close these days. And I called him. I told him I was going to do this. Like, hey, I'm going to outdo you on the Iron Warrior. And he's like, all right, man, good luck, do your thing. And I essentially turned it into an Ironman triathlon for the battalion. And so instead of swim, bike, run, we did the swim. So it was a 1.87 mile swim because we're the 187th Infantry Regiment. And instead of the bike, because I couldn't give 800 soldiers bikes, we did 3,187 stairs because we're third of the 187th in the local football stadium. And then instead of a marathon, which is what you do at the end of the Ironman, we did a 31.87 mile, you call it foot march. And so that was this series of events. And then we ended on the memorial field behind my headquarters, and I brought in country music stars from Nashville, Craig Morgan, who most people know. He's a veteran and a longtime supporter, and also a former member of the Rakkasans as an artilleryman. And I had some of my soldiers who were from the Pacific Islands. They did like the big pig roast in the ground kind of thing. And I made it this huge event because that's what I wanted. So I had all of Fort Campbell, literally all of Fort Campbell, that showed up to my headquarters that day to do all these events. And at the end of it, my plan was to announce all the stuff that was going to happen for the 50th anniversary. That's what I wanted. I wanted this big audience of veterans to hear this announcement. So I did. I got up on stage and, made a big deal. Again, I'm a talker. And at the end said, all right, guys, this is only the 49th. 1 year from now, we're going back to the Hill. And I mean, you could have heard a pin drop. Like everyone's like, what did he just say?
You're dumbfounded. Yeah.
We're going back to the Hill next year. And so that's how the announcement went. I think I said something like, these are older guys in their 70s, and some of them were already in their 80s. I said, you guys better get your fat ass in gear because you're walking up that damn hill. And they loved it. I mean, they loved the fact that I challenged them. They absolutely loved it. And 100% of them responded. And so these guys spent a year out walking and hiking, getting ready to go back to the Hill in 2019. And so fast forward a year later, now it's Hamburger Hill Week at Fort Campbell. We're doing the Iron Warrior events again, and it had blown up since the first year. But I never thought that would happen. That was never my intent. We had competitors coming literally from all over the U.S. I had people calling me from across the U.S. saying like, hey, I'm coming from Seattle. I heard about your event. Can I sign up? I was like, sure, we'd love to have you. So I essentially became a de facto race manager for a day. And then Fort Campbell got all pissed off. Like the docs and the hospital were worried I was going to kill everybody because I had all these people showing up to run 31 miles. And I had to convince them like nobody's going to die. We've done all the right things. But it was comical at best.
These were all Army folks.
No,
right?
These were people literally like just civilians off the street who had heard about it. Most of them were Army people, but not all of them. Some of them were vets. Some of them had no affiliation, but they heard what we were doing because the first year had been so wildly successful. I think the first year we had, I don't remember exactly, but about 700 people that did it. The second year it was more than double that. I mean, it was, even I was like, oh, wow, this is a lot. So overwhelming. But we got it. And at the end, and during that year, I had found an artist, a painter. We commissioned a painting for the 50th anniversary. And it's actually hanging there. You can't see it, but it's on my wall. And he did a painting, and we unveiled that painting that week. I built a bar in my battalion headquarters, and we christened the bar that week. And the name of the bar is Blackjacks. That's the battalion commander's call sign from Hamburger Hill. And so we did all these things that just made that week just incredible. And the most powerful one was, and this was actually my battalion S1. His name is Justin, or was Justin Wright. Now it's Major, or Captain Justin Wright. Now it's Major Justin Wright. He's actually the PO at the Ranger Regiment. It was his idea. He's like, hey, sir, when we come home from all of our deployments, our global war and terror deployments, there's these hangars and crowds and family, and they all come to welcome you with signs and banners. When these guys came home from Vietnam, first off, they were usually by themselves because they didn't deploy as a unit. They sure didn't come home as a unit. They weren't in uniform, because if they showed up in uniform, they got spat on and mistreated. A lot of them came back missing parts, pieces, and all kinds of stuff, because they sure as hell never got a welcome ceremony. Why don't we do that? And so I said, that's a great idea. So we, rented, for lack of a better word, the biggest hangar that was available on Fort Campbell, and it was massive. And literally the entire post, I had no idea this would happen. The entire post packed out that hangar. They made signs. We had bands, and people came to give speeches. And I am telling you, Paul, I mean, even right now, I get a little emotional thinking about it. We had all that pomp and circumstance going in the hangar, and I had the veterans formed up behind the hangar door outside, like in a battalion type formation. There was probably about 200 of them, give or take. And when we slid that giant hangar door back, and it's massive, and this group of 70 to, and the battalion commander, by the way, is standing in front of them, and he's 92 at the time.
Holy cow.
These guys, some of them are on canes, some of them are on walkers, some of them are blind, some of them are just messed up from their war wounds. They stood up stick straight, like they were privates back in basic training, stick straight. And they marched into that hangar, and the place erupted, just erupted. I mean, there are literally no words to accurately describe the emotions that ran through that building. And they marched in there, songs blaring, crowd cheering. And they got a speech from the honorary commander of the regiment, Lieutenant General retired Frank Brzezinski. And he did it all off the cuff. And it's probably the most powerful speech I've ever heard a military leader give. I strongly regret that I didn't record it, but it was the most emotionally charged and powerful speech I've ever heard. And then to top it all off, and this part, you could not have scripted it any better. After the speech, and the crowd is just erupting, Battalion Commander Weldon Honeycutt, he's actually a retired 2-star, but he's in his 90s. And I mean, he's old and frail, as you might imagine, but hasn't budged. I mean, if you would have told that guy charge the hill, he'd have done it. He's standing there in front of that formation, and his wife, Miss Marguerite, similar age, and they had been married at that point 70 something years. She gets up from across the room, walks across to the front of the formation, puts her hands on his cheeks, and says, "I love you, and I'm proud of you." And I saw a tear stream down his face. He didn't budge. I saw a tear stream down his cheek. I mean, come on. Again, if Hollywood would have been there to make a movie, they wouldn't have changed a thing. And so that was the send-off to Vietnam. That's the week of send-off that we got into Vietnam. And so we launched into Vietnam with that level of emotion. It was, I don't know that anyone could have had a more emotional experience than what was to be had that week. And so once we do get on the ground in Vietnam, and we took a couple of days to acclimate, it's a heck of a flight. It's more than a 24-hour flight. Sometimes it's even closer to 30, depending on layovers. And these, again, folks that are older, I had asked everyone to bring a family member with them, honestly, for safety reasons, but also just for emotional support reasons. And the vast majority did. And we spent a couple of days to acclimate. We did some sort of sightseeing, and they really rolled out the red carpet for us. The government of Vietnam did. They treated them like they were rock stars. But on the day, and by the way, I had coordinated through Chuck to bring surviving veterans of the North Vietnamese Army to interact with my guys that week. People that we had fought on Hamburger Hill, not just random North Vietnamese veterans, but people that we had fought on Hamburger Hill. And we had already interacted with them quite a few times leading up to the day that we climbed the hill. And it was about midway through the week. And when we got to the base of the hill, and of course, we're traveling with interpreters. It's May, so it's hot and it's humid. I did not know, none of us knew, that at the base of the hill, and Hamburger Hill it's massive. I mean, this is not like if you've been to Fort Benning, climbing up Cardiac Hill or something. I mean, it's a mountain. It's called Dong Ngap Bia in Vietnamese, which stands for the crouching beast. Because when you look across the A Shau Valley, it is the peak that's prominent, Hill 937 on military maps. So when we got to the base of Dong Ngap Bia, the Vietnamese had built a museum at the base, and it had been there for decades. We didn't know. This tiny little, Vietnamese museum, it's probably less than 800 square feet, but inside the museum, it is a museum dedicated to the Battle of Hamburger Hill. And there are pictures all around like you'd find in any museum. There's memorabilia, things that they had uncovered from the ground, both Vietnamese and American paraphernalia. But the incredible thing was on the wall, and some of the pictures of this little museum are my guys, some of who are standing there with me, preparing to walk up Hamburger Hill. And one of the Vietnamese veterans who was with us, actually was a female. She's in the picture on the wall. So here are my guys who are in these pictures. Here's this Vietnamese lady who's probably in her 70s and also elderly, but still in uniform and very proud. And there they all are in these pictures. And we're all standing there together about to ascend Dong Ngap Bia for the first time in 50 years. And it just gets crazier from there. So it was probably a group of about 35 to 40 of us from the Iron Rakkasans, mixture of veterans, and I did bring a handful of soldiers and officers with me. And as we began the walk up, and we knew it was going to be an all-day event. I mean, it's a big climb. The weather rolls in. I mean, it's monsoon season. And just like you've seen in the movies or you've read in the stories about Vietnam, it comes in very, very, very quick. And it went from what appeared to be a normal, nice weather day to, I would say, probably very threatening and frightening weather, to include at one point our Vietnamese guides. They turned to us and they said, we can't be out here in this weather. This is too dangerous. Someone's going to get hurt or killed. And they wanted me to turn back. And I just said, you have to excuse my language, but I said, there's no fucking way we're going back. So these men have been waiting 50 years for this moment. There's no way we're going back. And so we pushed forward, lightning striking. It was pretty intense. And when we got to about the halfway point, one of my veterans, Sergeant Chuck Van de Lucren, who probably was in the worst physical shape of the group, and it was all because of his injuries that he'd endured from his time on the hill 50 years prior. He couldn't go any further. He just sort of succumbed to his injuries and weakness, I guess you could say. And he collapsed into a mud puddle there as we were climbing the hill. And his daughter was with him, thankfully. And she just kind of said, hey, stand back. He's going into a flashback. Like, this occurs, rare, but it occurs. And he kind of went through an episode there laying on the ground in that mud puddle, going back up Hamburger Hill. And he had been evacuated about halfway through the battle. He had been a squad leader, actually. And I believe all the members of his squad ultimately were killed. And so I think he carried a ton of guilt around with him as a result of that. And that's the point where the guys just said, "Hey, we're not going forward. Like this is done." So I called my soldiers, my active duty soldiers, and I said, "Hey, nope, come back," because they had pushed on forward with some of the other veterans who were able to keep moving. And I sent them into the woods. And we got some bamboo poles and we built a stretcher, and we put Chuck on our shoulders. So we lifted him up out of this mud puddle and just laid him on a stretcher, and we carried him the rest of the way. Everyone just kind of took turns because there was still a long way to go and very steep and treacherous. And we carried him the rest of the way to the top of the hill. And I'll never forget when we laid him down on the ground at the top of the hill, he just let out this, which I can only describe as like a blood curdling, almost inhuman roar. To me, it was almost like he was just letting out all of these demons that he'd carried with him for 50 years. And his daughter told us later that she saw it in her father's face, that when we picked him up out of that mud puddle, he knew he was finally going to get to the top of the hill. And she said it was like she could just see demons like leaving his body, is almost how she described it. I mean, obviously you didn't actually see that, but like that's how it was described. It's like he transformed right there when we picked him up out of the mud, because he knew this battle that he'd been fighting his entire life, it was finally going to be over. And so when we got to the top of the hill, things like that were happening with all of the veterans. Some were very quiet, some were weeping, others were consoling each other. I had one gentleman who had been a machine gunner back in '69. He took his shirt off and just stood there with his shirt off, like he would have done, when he had been a soldier in the heat and the rain. And it was powerful. And I just gave them all the time that they wanted while we were up there. And all of them brought a memento from their fellow soldiers from the Rakasans from that battle and planted it somewhere up there in a location that meant something to them. And so that's what it was like to go through the process to get there. And I'll pause there. I can only imagine you got some thoughts and questions. Then I'll tell you some other stuff that happened up there and what that led to.
Yeah, I have a really big question that we can get to in a bit, and I'll ask it now, but you can answer it later. Why aren't we better as a society at serving and honoring our veterans? It's a massive question. And so I think I want to limit it to, why can't we be more consistent in doing things like taking them back to the benefit? Your nonprofit is not going to be able to serve the entire veteran community. It's just not going to be able to. You're going to help a bunch of people, but there need to be like 50 of these nonprofits, right? So anyway, don't answer that question, but I want to plant that seed. I can only imagine. My dad's a Vietnam vet. I think, did you mention your dad's a Vietnam vet as well?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. So he's told me a handful of stories he didn't talk to me really about it at all until I was in my 50s. I don't know what magically changed, but
sure.
He told me stories of people calling him a baby killer and
sure,
lots of other fun names. And it felt like you were literally doing the hardest thing humans do on earth. And people had not just lacking appreciation, they were actively mean-spirited towards you. I can't imagine the number and the size, if that's a thing, of the demons that were being let out.
Yeah.
And I wish every veteran who has been through that sort of, I'll call it trauma, and you've experienced this trauma as well. Like, man, what a powerful experience. And how does it take somebody exceptional like you, Jeremy? And I'll call you exceptional. You've lived an exceptional life. Does it take somebody like you to pull it off, or can we just put our noses down and just make it happen?
Can we just put our nose down and make it happen? Yes. But what does it take to get to that point? I think it takes a person or a personality that's willing to kind of plant the flag and say it's time to do stuff different. And I guess looking back on it, you use the word exceptional. I certainly didn't view it that way. And even at the time, I didn't view it as I was bucking the system. What I actually viewed it as is I was doing the right thing. I know that sounds a little simple, but it really is how I viewed it. And I think maybe in a way, that's why I had the courage to go ahead and do it, even when some folks told me not to do it. Hard right over the easy wrong. We've all heard that. I was certainly raised that way, thankfully. It doesn't mean I've always gotten it right. My gosh, I'm a human. I've had my fair share of mistakes, but it was never a doubt in my mind that it was the right thing to do and that we were going to do it. And we did. Thank God we did.
So I do have to ask the question, 2029 is less than 5 years away. I mean, are you going to be doing another version of what you did for the 50th?
Well, the honest answer is I don't know. It would be hard to pull off because the guys were already in their 70s and 80s. So now you're talking 80s and 90s. So I'd say it's unlikely that it would be similar to what we did with a similar group of people. But I think it's extremely likely. As a matter of fact, I'll just go ahead and say it here publicly. I'm confident that we will be doing something like that somewhere for some group that also needs that experience.
Yeah. And I read an article where you essentially told part of what you just told me. And look, you're an Iraqi veteran, right? You're an OIF veteran, and I didn't see any reference to OEF for you, but you've been to Iraq plenty of times. So.
Yeah, 3 tours in Iraq, 1 tour in the Balkans. Then I actually did 2 very short sort of special mission tours in Afghanistan.
Okay, so those veterans need that sort of experience on
yeah,
maybe not 10th anniversary. I don't know when you.
Those days are coming.
Yeah. Say that again.
Those days are coming. Yeah, you're right. They're going to need that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love what you're doing. I love the fact that you, Chuck, and John have formed this nonprofit, and I know John well enough, and I think I know you well enough at this point to know that you guys are very, very serious about it, and you're going to do everything you can to serve those veterans. Yeah. There's a massive cultural shift. I think it's needed in the military in this country, but we could talk for days about that.
That'll be the next podcast episode.
Yeah. Let me learn a little bit more about you. Where did you grow up?
Born and raised in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So if you're not familiar with where Chattanooga is, it's right where the state of Georgia and Alabama meet the Tennessee line. It's right there. And my father's family was from the Georgia side of the line, a little town called Ringgold, and my mother's family was from Chattanooga. And my mother's family, pretty well known in Chattanooga, not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. Most of them were blue collar workers, but nonetheless, it was a large family in Chattanooga that was very well known.
My sister went to Sewanee, so I'm familiar with that part of the country, and it's gorgeous.
It is.
It's a wonderful part of the country, and people should visit. I've actually never been to Chattanooga, but I've been to Sewanee several times.
Yeah, Chattanooga is a beautiful city. It was a sort of a rusted out steel town when I was a kid, and it's changed dramatically. Those changes started occurring in the late 80s, early 90s when they decided to revitalize the downtown. A lot of money went into making the River Walk and the Tennessee Aquarium and those sorts of things. And it's really dramatically changed Chattanooga over the decades that follow. It's not even the same place at all now.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that because there are lots of smaller to mid-sized cities that have not done that rejuvenation, and it's
but I would tell you, Paul, Chattanooga was, I won't say Chattanooga. My childhood, I was very fortunate. Yeah, being a kid of the 80s was a good time to be a kid. I didn't have a lot of complaints in terms of what was going on. Right, we rode our Huffy bikes and threw rocks at cars and stole gum from the local gas station. What normal kids do, kind of stuff. I loved it. We didn't have fancy shoes. My family did not have money, but we bought our clothes at Kmart and Walmart and had fried chicken for dinner on Sundays and lived a pretty ideal little life there in small town, southeastern US. But the big moment for me in Chattanooga was I was just obsessed with football as a kid. All of my cousins and uncles that had been big football players there in various high schools in Chattanooga, and some had even gone on to play in college. And I thought, well, that's what I actually was convinced, by the way, I was going to be the left tackle for the Dallas Cowboys. That was my life plan, by the way.
Hold on, Jeremy. How tall are you?
I am not even close to being tall enough for that. I'm 5'10", about 190. So yeah, I didn't quite meet the height criteria, but that's what I thought when I was a kid. But nonetheless, by the time I got to middle school, I was pretty capable football player. I was a linebacker, and I played center on offense by that point. And my middle school football team was really good, and I was one of the captains. There was a couple of us that were captains, and we ended up playing in the city championship against the big time local international boarding school out of Tennessee called the Baylor School. And I went to a very inner city school. Wasn't nice. It was old and run down and some rough crowds. And we beat them. We were not supposed to, and we beat them. And after the game, the coach of this big international boarding school approached my coach and said, "Hey, great game. You got a great team. If you've got anyone on your team that you think has what it takes, we'd love to, consider bringing them over to our school." It's called the Baylor School. We just call it Baylor, but it's called the Baylor School. And so the coach approached me and said, "Hey, are you interested?" And I remember thinking at the time, well, I'm a kid. I don't get to make those decisions. I don't really know how that works. But somebody called my mom about a week later, and they started recruiting me to go to this boarding school. And, again, we didn't have money. We were a normal family. And that school, I don't recall the cost. It was, $15,000, $20,000 a year to go there. So my mom's like, "Well, we'd love for him to go, but we don't have enough money to even put gas in the car. So not sure how that's going to work." And somebody came out of the woodwork somewhere. And to this day, I don't know who those people are. And they paid my full tuition to go to this top tier private school in the Southeast for the next 4 years. And all I had to do was go be a football star at that place. And I had to maintain a I think it was 3.5 GPA, something like that. So I did. And that was, as you might imagine, an extremely pivotal moment in my young life, because what that school did for me and how it changed me and matured me, taught me things about leadership that I probably would have not been exposed to at an early age, challenged me. I mean, there are no words to describe how fortunate I am to have had that opportunity. And I will never not give back to those folks as well. And I do. I volunteer with that school every chance I get, and I give speeches, and I help. They have a leadership program that they run, and I try to give back to that as much as possible. But I'm telling you, Paul, that's probably the most important thing that happened to me as a young person, was getting pulled off that football field and sent to the other side of town to this school. Because when you're surrounded by international classmates, and now you're surrounded by a group of adults who there is no other expectation other than that you just be the best at everything you do, and you do it with the highest moral standards. Again, my gosh, how fortunate was I to have that experience.
Was it all boys?
It had been a military school and an all-boys school in that transition just a couple years before they went away from the military environment, maybe 5 or 6 years before I got there. And then they became a co-ed school, I think 1 or 2 years before I got there.
Yeah, it's funny. You and I have similar experiences. I went to from public school, sort of a country, rural sort of public school experience. And then in 8th grade, my mom said, "You're not going to go to the same high school your dad and I went to. You're going to go to one of these two schools. You get to pick out of those two, but that's it. It's one of those two." And I still have really good friends that I grew up with before 8th grade, but they were doing zero homework, and I was doing 3 to 4 hours of homework every single night. I was required to play a sport, which wasn't a big deal for me because I love playing sports anyway. But man, you want to talk about looking back at that experience? Like, I am so proud that I went through that school and got over the hurdles that I needed to get over, and those hurdles weren't even recognized by my old peer set from my childhood. And yeah, it's just an amazing experience, but it's not everybody gets that opportunity.
Yeah, no, I was very fortunate, and I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my brother. He's 2 years older than I. He's the oldest of the three of us. I'm the youngest. But when decision time came for that, I actually was leaning towards not going. Again, I was a young kid, and all my friends were at this other place. I didn't want to leave my friends. And my brother, who was about to graduate, I think, from that public school, he pulled me aside. We divorced parents, and I remember very vividly. He said, "Jeremy, I'm not your dad. Obviously, I'm not trying to be your dad." He said, "But there's no way in hell I'm going to let you F up this opportunity." He goes, "You're going to that place whether you like it or not," and that's the end of it.
Yeah,
he had never done that before, but he did. I mean, and I give him a lot of credit for that.
Well, he's wise for that age.
Yeah,
most kids getting ready to leave high school are not that wise
to
begin with, and not that courageous, right? It was hard to have that conversation with you.
Yeah,
something like I'm walking away from what I know into an unknown.
Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. You tight with your brother now?
We are, as a matter of fact, we talk quite often, whether it's personal or professional, and we have had some pretty incredible adventures over the course of our lifetime, but we won't talk about all those here. Some of them I probably shouldn't put on tape anyway.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Football and then going into the military, were there things about football that made the transition easier?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny you brought up Swanee. I thought I was going to be the left tackle for the Dallas Cowboys, so I just assumed I was going to go play football in college. I thought for sure, Bear Bryant would be calling me and offer me a full ride somewhere, but that didn't happen. But I did get a full ride offer from Swanee. So, I think it was Swanee, and I think the other school was called Emory and Henry, and then there was one other small school. And I had never heard of the other ones. At least I'd heard of Swanee, so I went to have a meeting with the coach, and I'll never forget this. He was at my high school, and for some reason during the meeting, I looked down at my watch. And this is obviously way before Apple Watches, so I was just checking the time, and the coach lost his shit on me for looking at my watch. He's like, "Hey kid, if you got somewhere better to be, why don't you just go?" And I remember thinking at the time, like, you're kind of an asshole, man. Like, I'm not going to come play football at a school I don't want to go to for a coach who's an asshole. And I remember I just left. I was like, "All right, thanks." And I got up, walked out, and that was the end of that. And, I went to Auburn. I had always wanted to go to a big SEC school anyway. So I ended up at Auburn. But your question about football and transition to the Army is why I bring that up. I don't know, maybe it's a weakness. I just wanted to do the hardest thing I could find, I guess. So when I got to Auburn, I was pre-med, because in my mind, that's the hardest thing that you could do, and go be a doctor. And then I joined the Army and thought I'd be an Army doctor. And the Army had other plans for me. They came back to me at some point and said, "Yeah, sorry, you're not going to be an Army doctor. You got to pick something else." And I said, "Well, I'll be an airborne ranger infantryman." And when I first got out of Auburn and into some real Army things, I really thought, "Oh man, this is going to be awful. They're going to just break me and destroy me." I mean, I've seen the movies like the rest of us, Full Metal Jacket or whatever. And as I got into that stuff, what I realized is none of it, I'm telling you, Paul, none of it was as hard as football practice at that prep school over those 4 years. Because we were literally a top tier program. We had national championships under our belt before I got there. We've since had similar levels of success. We were undefeated for 4 years while I was there. I mean, the program was crazy intense. I think maybe it was so intense that if you try to do that today, like, some of the coaches might get in trouble. But I mean, it was hard. It was hard. And what I didn't realize at the time is that they were building grit. They were building tough young men, putting us through that experience. And so by the time I got to the Army and really Ranger School, which is very hard, I'm looking to my left and right, and I'm not saying it was easy for me, but I can promise you it wasn't as much of a shock to me as it was to everyone else, because honestly, physically, Ranger School was not as hard as what those coaches had been on us when I was a much younger person. So I really was thankful again to those coaches. And I've said that to them so many times over the years. I know they get a kick out of it. Ranger School is hard, but it sure as hell wasn't hard as 2-a-days football practice for a month during Tennessee summers in 100-degree heat. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah, and they knew what they were doing. They wanted the winning program, certainly, but they were more importantly building young men. And private schools have more latitude when it comes to that sort of thing than the local government school system. Yeah, Jeremy, I'm going to have you back maybe a couple of times, and if you have another 30 minutes or so, I'd love to go another 30 if you can afford that. I'd love to bring you back for the topic we were talking about before we started recording it. And there's a lot more of your story that I want to explore as well.
Okay.
You've served a long time. You've been there and done that to a lot of places. I want to explore all that. And I don't think we're going to get to all of that in the next 30 minutes. But I do want to ask, do you have a Ranger School story where you fell asleep in a place you weren't supposed to? Did you have a mini hallucination at one point? I mean, I have so many stories in my head rattling around because I know a lot of guys that have been through Ranger School. I never had, unfortunately, the opportunity to go, but you have a fun story or two?
I got a couple. I'll give you two because you're right. There are many. The first one actually is probably the most entertaining. So like any young infantry lieutenant, as soon as you finish the basic course, we called it IOBC back then, Infantry Officer Basic Course, you go straight to Ranger School, which I certainly did. And I was in great shape, so wasn't intimidated by the physical requirements of it. But I think it was day one, it might have been day two. The first phase is the Derby phase. You call it Hell Week, whatever you want to call it. It's where they're just basically trying to break you down. But part of that is they run you through the Ranger Training Brigade's little chow hall facility there on the Ranger camp. And it's probably reminiscent to that scene from G.I. Jane, if you recall that, when they're bringing them in off the beach, they're running them through the chow line, they're throwing food at them, and it's just chaos. I mean, it really was sort of like that. And the lunch ladies behind the counter put all this food on my tray, and I'm a young second lieutenant, so I'm just going through the thing. And I go and I sit down and I eat as much as I can because it's hot and it's the middle of summer, so I wasn't very hungry. And then the Ranger instructor started yelling at us like, "All right, it's time to go. Get ready your trays." And this was all transpired in 5 minutes. I don't know. And so I go to take my tray back and it's piled high with food. And that was the end of that. I mean, they lost their shit on me. Like, "Ranger Bowling, you sit down and you Rangers don't waste food." I'm like, it's like a mountain of food. What do you want me to do? And so now I'm a known entity, right? Because now I'm the guy that didn't finish his food. And I sat there as long as I could. And I remember at one point looking up at the RI, like, "Look, man, we can sit here all day. I'm not going to be able to eat all this. And if I eat one more bite, I'm probably going to vomit all over the place." And then he didn't like that. So my first go at Ranger School ended pretty rapidly. It was a couple of days after that. They basically tossed me out and they're like, "Yeah, get the fuck out of here." Because I started talking back to the RIs because they just kept, pulling me out of the crowd and focusing on me. And at some point, I just remember I snapped and said something like, "F you guys," whatever. I was young, dumb, with a chip on my shoulder. And they're and I was out the door within what felt like 3 seconds kind of thing. But, actually, I got to tell you, again, I think that was a good experience for me. I certainly didn't know it at the time. I was angry and pissed and all the normal emotions. But I matured so much because I had not failed at a lot going into that. Sure, I'd a couple of lost wrestling matches or football games kind of thing, but not at a big ticket item like that. And that was a miserable failure for me. And my gosh, thank goodness that happened. And so I had to go back a couple years later and ask special permission to be able to go back to Ranger School. And funny, the brigade commander at the time I went back of Ranger School was a guy named K.K. Chin. Well, he had been the battalion commander at Ranger School the first time I went. He remembered me. He's like, "Oh yeah, I remember you, man." So when I go back I actually went back as a captain. And he's like, "Well, why do you want to go back?" And I laid out for him, well, I'd already done multiple combat deployments. I'd already done da. He's like, "All right, stop. Yes, you need to come back to Ranger School." Approved. So I went back to Ranger School and was going through it again and got thrown out a second time because now I'm in the mountains phase. And, you're pretty smoked by that point because you're kind of at the halfway point. And I think I was a squad leader or a fire team leader on one of the patrols. We come under contact. We immediately start returning fire. And as, of course, everybody's weapon always malfunctions in Ranger School because you're exhausted. No one ever does weapons maintenance. So my weapon jams as I'm trying to return fire. And the first sergeant, like the actual Ranger Training Brigade first sergeant, just like starts screaming at me and yelling at me to move my team and get them in place. And I for whatever reason at that moment, I forgot that I was not a captain. I had already commanded a company by that point. I turned back to him. I said, hold the F on, first sergeant. I'm in the middle of, and he's like, rips me out of the front line again. Like, you out of here, Ranger. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this just happened a second time. So I'm standing off to the side while they complete actions on the objective. And I had actually gotten to know the RIs really well because I was, one of the older students in that class. And the RI's like, sir, what happened? I'm like, blah, blah, blah. I told him exactly what happened. I mean, it's definitely my fault. I was like, look, man, I've already commanded a company. I just had a little bit of a brain fart, I guess you could call it, like that I'm a student, not a company commander. Like, we'll talk to him. And so I could see they all went over to the first sergeant and they talked and they explained, like, this is not Second Lieutenant Bowling. This is Captain Bowling and blah, blah, blah. So the first sergeant comes over and he says, sir, I have never done this before and I will never do this again, but you're going to get a second chance. But if you step out of line at all, you're done. So he pulls me off the sidelines, puts me back into the course, and I went through and finished the course, no problem. So I like to say I'm the only one that I know of who's ever actually been kicked out of Ranger School twice and still managed to graduate.
Yeah, I had a guy on the podcast who was, I don't think he ever left the school.
Yeah, there's a lot of those.
but he finally was tabbed at 177 days.
Yeah, I don't know how those guys do. I've said my entire career, I think those guys have a level of toughness that most normal people don't have. I mean, that is a long time to endure that level of physical punishment.
Well, and for people that don't really understand Ranger School, the reason, two of the reasons it's so hard is you're not eating nearly as much as you should, given how much movement you guys are going through every day, and you're not getting much sleep to speak of.
Oh yeah, you lose 30 to 40 pounds, and you're averaging sleep of anywhere from 1 to 3 hours a night for the course of months. So yeah, I don't know how that guy was able to do that. That's inhuman that he did that.
Yeah, it doesn't register to me as human for sure. Was it cold or hot or pretty?
Oh gosh, I'm a hot weather guy. My oldest son went through Ranger School a couple of years ago in the cold weather, and I told him, I was like, buddy, better you than me, man. Having grown up and endured those 2 days in football camp, and I'm serious, Paul. I watched my Ranger buddies who were from Michigan and places like they were dropping like flies because it's hot. It's 100 degrees, 100% humidity. And I was no problem. Just bebopping along, like, give me that weight. I'll carry it because this is my kind of weather. So I was all about the hot weather. I would much rather be covered in sweat and dirt and dust than freezing any day.
So you were commissioned in 99. And obviously when you were commissioned, you had no idea that 9/11 was going to happen.
Yeah.
How did the world change for you when 9/11 happened? Because you were still a lieutenant, right?
I was actually. I was at a JRTC rotation, the Joint Readiness Training Center down at Fort Polk, Louisiana. And we were actually training for our first deployment, which was going to be to the Balkans. I was in the 3rd Infantry Division at the time. And so we were in the middle of that rotation when it occurred. And funny story, I was a infantry company XO, executive officer, and it was morning. I'd gone to have breakfast and have a cup of coffee and went to find the porta potty to take care of business. And my very good friend, Steve Hedger, comes and bangs on the door. He goes, XO, come on, we're under attack. And I thought he meant like the opposing force, the Op 4 from GRTC was probing the line or whatever, right? And I'm like, all right, dude, I'm doing the best I can, right? I'll be out in a minute kind of thing. And he's like, Jeremy, no, the U.S. is under attack right now. I was like, what? So hurry up and get out of there. And he had one of those back in those days. You remember those little tiny, like transistor TVs that were black and white that you could carry. They're kind of long. He had one of those because he was the maintenance officer. And we sat there on his cot under a tent at GRTC and watched all of that transpire like everyone else on the news. And it was, there's no way that anybody there didn't realize that your life had just changed forever. I mean, they started organizing, they stopped the rotation and they began to organize us, giving us ammo and weapons and plan to go defend Fort Polk because nobody knew what was happening. Like, is this an invasion of the US? Like what else is coming? We didn't end up doing that, but that plan at least started. And then they immediately said, well, you guys aren't going to Kosovo anymore. You're going to, now you're going to train to go somewhere else. That didn't happen either. We deployed the next month to Kosovo. And while we were in Kosovo, the invasion of Afghanistan occurred. And we came right back from Kosovo. And a few months later, we're in the desert of Kuwait preparing to invade Iraq. So, yeah, it was wild. And in the middle of all that, I got married. I had, met my wife when I was a young lieutenant. And we got engaged probably just before 9/11 or maybe shortly thereafter. I guess it would have been right after. So we went to Kosovo. I came home and got married and then deployed right away out to the desert. So now not only has it changed my life forever, it's changed the life of this young lady who had agreed to be my wife before the world changed. So that started the next 3 decades of really an odyssey that we experienced.
Yeah, it takes a special person to see their loved one go off to be in harm's way that many times. I mean, I don't know how your wife did it.
I mean, I bluntly, I don't know either. I'm sure she could tell you some stories, and there were many, some really tough ones. Her dad was also an infantry officer. He retired in the early 90s after 26 years as an infantry officer. He was a colonel, also Vietnam vet. So she grew up moving all over the world, PCSing just like the rest of us. So I suspect that went a long way to help prepare her, but none of that was her living the life of a deployed spouse with casualties happening all the time and the stuff that was occurring over the course of those years. I mean, there's nothing you can really do to prepare for that. And, we started having children and now she's got tiny kids at home and I'm forward deployed and she may not hear from me for long periods of time. And people are coming home in body bags at times. I mean, I can only imagine.
Yeah, were you in command for 1 or 2 of your deployments?
I was a company commander for the second half of my second deployment to Iraq. I took command while deployed.
I'm sure you've seen We Were Soldiers Once and Young.
Yep.
And Colonel Howe's wife was effectively the leader of the spouses and families left behind. Did your wife play a similar role?
She absolutely did. And I got to tell you, to this day, she gets called from wives that are still out there because she was so good at it. She just was. And probably the hardest thing for me to watch on her behalf was that deployment where I was a company commander and she had to take over that responsibility at the company level. And the other wives that were already there were not receptive to the fact that there was a change of command. Don't know why, but that's just what they were, to include the battalion commander's wife. And so she now is in this position of incredible stress. We had casualties, and she's surrounded by women that are making it even harder on her for who knows what reason. A lot of tears, rightly so. And if I could go back and change anything in my Army career again and be sort of omnipotent for the day or whatever the right word would be, it would be a change to that situation. She didn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that, but she certainly didn't deserve that. And what that did to her so wrong. And those people who were part of that were so wrong. And I'll never forget that. But I'll also never not have the highest level of respect for her because of what she did through all of that. Because even through all of that, she did the right thing every time. Every time she just did the right thing. And I venture to say that that's probably wouldn't have been the case maybe for others. It was awful, just absolutely awful that she was put through that.
The role is incredibly difficult to begin with, and she's raising small kids
Right.
without you there.
Right.
And she's got a tough job. And if everybody's being positive and supportive, and we're all in this together, let's make this happen. It's still really, really hard.
Right.
And then people are just. It boggles my mind. The older I get, the more I realize that not everybody's good to the rest of mankind.
Agreed. Yeah. Agreed.
I didn't know we were going to stumble into that part of the story, but
this is my life. These are real stories, and my wife is a part of my life, is the biggest part of my life. So these are the stories of our lives.
Yeah, and I tell my wife all the time. I deployed once to Iraq, and we had 3 small kids. They were 1, 3, and 5 when I left, and I tell her all the time her job was a million times harder than anything I could have done.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So I really want to talk about your combat experiences in our next conversation, if you'll come back.
Of course.
Where do we want to end? Do we want to talk about your wife and sons a little bit more, maybe?
I couldn't be more proud. So that's a great way to end it. So my wife and I have been married for this year will be 23 years. Our oldest son is in the Army. He's actually in my old battalion. He's a first lieutenant promotable, Ranger qualified, and has done an excellent job. As a matter of fact, you'll love this, Paul. One of my Hamburger Hill vets that went with us to the top in 2019 was the one that promoted my son from second lieutenant to first lieutenant because I was TDY out of the country. I couldn't do it. And he did it in the bar that I built, Blackjacks, in the battalion headquarters. So it was pretty awesome.
Man.
I got to say that. So he's doing great, just great. And then our youngest son he's halfway through his junior year at Auburn University, which I also love. As an Auburn alum, of course, I thought that was super cool. And he is crushing it. He is the most focused, disciplined 20-year-old. And I'm not just saying this because I'm his dad. He's the most focused, disciplined 20-year-old I've ever seen. Way more so than I was at that stage of life. And he was the youngest president in the history of his fraternity at Auburn, and he's running for office. He's already got a job lined up for after school, and he's going to grad school. I mean, he's crushing it. He's just a great, great young man as well. So very proud of both of them. And then my wife, right? I mean, she did anything and everything for all of us for all of those years, raise the kids alone, deal with all the things that come along with being an Army spouse. And when our kids were old enough, she decided to go back to grad school and start a new career for herself. And so she's now a behavioral health therapist and has been doing that for, I think, the better part of 5 years now. She actually runs her own private practice and is incredibly successful, as you might imagine, because she's equipped to help people deal with all of the challenges that they face, because she's been through most of them, sometimes in spades. And she gets a ton of accolades from the folks that she works with, but for all the help that she brings to them. And I'm 100% convinced that her life experience has helped equip her for that, and she's really good at it. So yeah, I'm proud of all 3 of them. I'm a very, very, very fortunate guy to have the wife and kids that I have.
Is she serving the general community, or is she more focused on veterans or something else?
The general community. Yep.
Yeah.
She'll help anyone that needs the help is the bottom line.
All right. I have a guy that listens to these recordings before I release them, and he does the little write-up, and he would love it if you would say, if you're comfortable saying the names of.
Yeah. My wife's name is Kerry. It's the Irish spelling, Kerry. Her family is very Irish, as you might imagine. The name comes from County Kerry of Ireland, She has another sister named Claire, just like County Claire. So that's their Irish background. Our oldest son, his name is Ethan, Ethan. And then our youngest son, his name is Jackson, but he goes by Jack.
Are you planning a trip right now somewhere with your nonprofit?
We are, yes.
Not ready to announce yet?
Well, it's in the works. As a matter of fact, just before jumping on this podcast today, I was coming out of a meeting where I was starting to lay some groundwork for what that's going to be. But let's hold off on it for now. But it looks like it's going to come. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. So all of our work this year, we're trying to tie it to that.
Okay. All right. Got it. Makes sense. Very cool. Well, Jeremy, I was definitely looking forward to this. As I told you before, you're one of the most well-spoken people I've ever been around, and that requires a lot of practice, a lot of thought, a lot of deep thought, critical thought. And I appreciate everything you've done for this country and who you are as a person. And I'm glad I've had an opportunity to meet you. And I will support. I think I told you, John and Chuck, this the last time the four of us were together. I'll support you guys with this podcast or in any other way that you guys need me. Just point me in the direction and I'll help where I can.
Thanks, Paul. That really means a lot. It really does. And, you have a platform to share your voice. And so the fact that you're willing to support the work that we're doing, it's important. And we're grateful for
it. I can't think of anything more important to do on this platform.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate the invitation to sit down with you today. And like I said, I'm happy to come back.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd also really appreciate if you'd rate and review us. You can find us at scodupodcast.com.